Also in the Guinness Book of World Records, right?
I am?
Yeah. Aren't you in there in the category?
Before he passed, Paul Newman revealed something few could have imagined. A private list of the 7 actors he hated the most. To the world, Newman was Hollywood royalty, the embodiment of sophistication and grace. Those piercing blue eyes, that effortless charm. He seemed like a man above pettiness, someone who carried himself with quiet dignity across 5 decades of superstardom. But beneath the cool exterior and carefully cultivated humanitarian image, Newman was still human. And like any man, he had his limits.
Marlon's name, and he said, "Oh, that's one of the stories that I forgot."
In his later years, as he reflected on his remarkable career, Newman began to speak more candidly to those closest to him. He admitted frustrations, disappointments, and a handful of colleagues who, despite their fame, left him infuriated. The discovery shocked many because Newman almost never aired grievances in public. For decades, he had been considered the consummate professional, a man who avoided scandal and rarely spoke ill of others. But privately, he kept score. Newman's grievances weren't about petty jealousies or gossip. They were about values, professionalism, dedication, and respect for the craft of acting. He despised arrogance, laziness, and ego trips, especially when they disrupted the collaborative spirit of filmmaking. As director Martin Ritt once said of his friend, "Paul had a longer fuse than most in this business, but when it burned out, that was it. You were done." This list was never meant for public consumption, yet it has become one of the most revealing aspects of Newman's legacy. It strips away the myth of a flawless gentleman and shows the man behind the legend. Principled, demanding, and unwilling to tolerate what he saw as irresponsibility. So who were the 7 actors who tested Paul Newman's patience to its breaking point? Let's begin with number 7. Tom Cruise. The 7th spot on Newman's list might surprise you. After all, Tom Cruise wasn't just another young star. He was Newman's co-star in The Color of Money, 1986, the role that finally earned Newman his long-overdue Academy Award. To the public, their pairing looked like a symbolic passing of the torch, the veteran legend guiding the ambitious upstart. But behind the camera, Newman was far less charmed. For Newman, acting came down to 3 values: preparation, professionalism, and humility. He had little tolerance for actors who treated the craft casually or turned film sets into stages for their egos. In Cruise, Newman saw undeniable talent and commitment, but also a relentless, almost manic energy that grated on him. Producer Richard Zanuck later explained, "Paul just wanted to work. Tom was bouncing off walls, calling Paul a god, showering him with compliments. It embarrassed him more than it flattered him." The real breaking point came during the publicity campaign. Newman loathed press tours, preferring to let the work speak for itself. Cruise, by contrast, thrived on them, dominating interviews, spinning every question back to his dedication, his workouts, his methods. Martin Scorsese remembered Newman venting after one junket. "If that kid interrupts me one more time to tell a reporter how much he's learned from me, while flexing his arms, I'm going to throw him out a window." It was said with humor, but the frustration was real. On set, Newman never allowed the tension to show. He stayed professional, but privately he complained that Cruise's hunger for attention clashed with the serious way he viewed the craft. Joanne Woodward later admitted Paul found it almost laughable. Here was a young actor boasting about dedication, while Newman had carried decades of work without ever needing to brag. Publicly, Newman kept his remarks careful. Asked about Cruise, he offered faint praise with a sting. "He's a very dedicated young man with abundant energy. Sometimes abundant energy can be abundant." Ironically, The Color of Money was a triumph for both. Newman finally received his Oscar, and Cruise earned credibility by standing alongside him. But while the collaboration looked seamless on screen, Newman never forgot how draining it felt. For him, Cruise wasn't a rival, he was an endurance test. Proof that even the most patient professional could be pushed to the edge by ego and boundless energy. Charlton Heston. If Tom Cruise symbolized youthful energy clashing with Newman's discipline, Charlton Heston represented something deeper: ideology and values. Their animosity is especially striking because the two men never even worked together. They weren't rivals for roles or billing. Their conflict reflected the broader political divides that split Hollywood in the 1960s and 70s. Heston was the face of screen heroism. With his commanding presence, he brought epics like The Ten Commandments, 1956, and Ben-Hur, 1959 to life, embodying moral authority for audiences worldwide. But Newman, increasingly outspoken in his liberal activism, bristled at Heston's off-screen choices. He once told friends, "It's hard to watch Moses selling guns." By the late 1960s, Newman had become a fixture in progressive causes. He campaigned for civil rights, opposed the Vietnam War, and poured money into political campaigns. Heston, who had once marched with Dr. King, drifted in the opposite direction, gradually aligning with conservative causes. His later role as president of the NRA cemented the divide. To Newman, this wasn't just a shift in ideology, it was a betrayal of responsibility. Joanne Woodward later admitted, Paul couldn't reconcile the man giving NRA speeches with the man who played heroes on screen. It wasn't disagreement, it was disappointment. The tension wasn't abstract. In 1966, during the heat of a political campaign season, Newman and Heston found themselves in the same Los Angeles restaurant. Newman, actively backing anti-war candidate Eugene McCarthy, refused even to acknowledge Heston at a nearby table, a quiet but unmistakable snub. Actor Robert Vaughn, who shared Newman's politics, later confirmed, Paul believed actors had responsibilities that came with visibility. He thought Charlton's politics were harmful. He couldn't separate the man from the message. Newman rarely spoke of Heston directly, but in 1978 he delivered a pointed remark. Some people confuse having played great men with being great men. I find that problematic. He never named Heston, but few doubted who he meant. For Newman, this wasn't about career competition or ego. It was about principle. He had no patience for stars who, in his view, used their fame irresponsibly. Charlton Heston, to him, embodied how even a great screen legend could lose sight of the real-world consequences of their platform. Frank Sinatra. If Charlton Heston made Newman's list for politics, Frank Sinatra earned his place for something Newman could never abide: unprofessionalism. The two men only worked together once, on the 1980 disaster film When Time Ran Out. But the experience was enough to leave Newman simmering for years afterward. Sinatra was, of course, the chairman of the board, a music legend, Rat Pack king, and cultural icon. On stage, he was untouchable. But on a film set, especially by the late 1970s, he had little patience for the grind of movie making. Sinatra's reputation preceded him. He liked to work fast, hated multiple takes, and believed his star power could carry him through. For Paul Newman, who prepared obsessively and treated every role with reverence, this approach was intolerable. Director James Goldstone, who worked with both men at different points, later explained, Paul prepared for every single scene like it was Shakespeare. Frank would show up, glance at the script, do one take, and leave. That kind of contrast doesn't just cause tension, it's combustible. The set of When Time Ran Out reportedly became a war of styles. Newman, punctual and meticulous, would arrive early and rehearse. Sinatra, by contrast, sometimes appeared hours late, holding up production. Co-star William Holden later told friends of one particular day when Newman finally confronted Sinatra. Though Paul never raised his voice, his words cut deep. Frank, this isn't just about you. We've all been waiting. This is disrespectful to everyone here. Sinatra didn't take kindly to being scolded, especially by a fellow star. From that day forward, their interactions were cold, professional at best, hostile at worst. Newman later alluded to the clash with one of his famously sharp but subtle lines. Asked about Sinatra in a 1994 interview, he smiled politely and said, Frank has a lovely singing voice. Nothing about his acting, nothing about his professionalism, just a backhanded compliment that revealed exactly what Newman thought. The irony, of course, was that Sinatra didn't need acting the way Newman did. His fame, his music, and his lifestyle gave him a cushion that Newman never sought. But for Newman, that was exactly the problem. He believed success carried responsibilities to the crew, to the craft, to the audience. When Sinatra coasted, Newman felt it wasn't just laziness, it was disrespect. In the end, Sinatra represented everything Newman disliked about Hollywood excess. Talent used as an excuse for bad behavior. For Paul Newman, that was unforgivable. Marlon Brando. Perhaps the most shocking name on Newman's list was Marlon Brando. Both men were alumni of the Actors Studio, both hailed as icons of American cinema. And for much of his early career, Newman was compared to Brando as the next great method actor. Yet Newman's private feelings toward Brando were not admiration, they were disappointment. Brando was widely considered a genius, redefining screen acting with his raw, naturalistic performances in A Streetcar Named Desire 1951 and On the Waterfront 1954. For young actors like Newman, Brando was the standard to aspire to. But as decades passed, Brando's reputation shifted. His brilliance was still there, but it came inconsistently. He grew notorious for showing up unprepared, using cue cards hidden around sets, and treating acting with a dismissive casualness that infuriated professionals like Newman. Robert Redford, Newman's close friend, recalled Newman's bitter metaphor. Paul told me once that watching Brando later in his career was like watching someone burn a Picasso for heat. You know it's valuable, but it's wasted for something careless. Newman could not abide wasted potential. He had fought his entire career for credibility, clawing his way from pretty boy roles into serious dramas, proving that he was more than just those blue eyes. Seeing Brando squander his immense talent felt like an insult, not just to himself, but to the entire profession. Eva Marie Saint, who worked with Newman on Exodus 1960, once summed up Newman's philosophy: Paul believed you owed your best to everyone on set. If you showed up unprepared, it wasn't just your problem, it was everyone's. For Newman, Brando violated that golden rule repeatedly. In one of his last interviews, Newman didn't name Brando directly, but delivered a cutting remark. Great talent comes with great responsibility. Not everyone understands that. Film historians immediately recognized who he meant. The irony is that Newman and Brando never actually worked together, but Newman still carried resentment from a distance. Their rivalry wasn't over roles, but over standards. Newman revered the craft of acting like a sacred trust. Brando, in Newman's view, treated it like a casual game. And for Newman, that was worse than arrogance or politics. It was betrayal. Steve McQueen. Few rivalries embodied Hollywood machismo more than Paul Newman and Steve McQueen. Both were symbols of cool, both represented a certain brand of rebellious stardom in the 1960s and 70s, and both were fiercely competitive. Their clash finally came to a head on the 1974 disaster epic, The Towering Inferno, and it cemented McQueen's place on Newman's blacklist. From the beginning, McQueen approached the film as a battle for dominance. He demanded equal billing, equal pay, even an equal number of lines. Legend has it he insisted on having the same number of stairs to climb during the film's fiery action sequences. Most famously, McQueen refused to allow Newman's name to appear above his own in the credits. The compromise was one of the strangest in Hollywood history. McQueen's name appeared first, but lower. Newman's appeared second, but higher, an awkward visual tie. Director John Guillermin later admitted, "It was exhausting. We were making a film about people setting aside ego to save lives, and off-camera Steve was counting lines. Paul just wanted to do the work. The contrast was ridiculous. For Newman, the experience confirmed what he already suspected about McQueen. He wasn't interested in collaboration. He was interested in competition." Newman once remarked in a 2002 interview, "Some actors see every film as a competition. I always saw it as a collaboration. Those two approaches don't mix well." Actress Faye Dunaway, who knew both men, agreed, "Paul approached acting as a craft. Steve approached it as a battlefield. They were oil and water." Though their rivalry was mostly professional, it stung Newman deeply. He had built his career on generosity, supporting fellow actors, and serving the story above all else. McQueen, by contrast, seemed obsessed with status. For Newman, that was not just frustrating, it was exhausting. Their on-screen chemistry worked because of the tension, but once the camera stopped, Newman had no desire to repeat the experience. To him, McQueen was proof that some stars cared more about winning than about art. John Wayne. At number 2 comes one of Hollywood's most iconic figures, John Wayne. The animosity between Newman and Wayne had less to do with sets and more to do with politics, and it was fierce. By the 1960s, America was deeply divided over the Vietnam War, and Hollywood reflected that split. Newman became one of the era's most visible liberal activists, campaigning for anti-war politicians, speaking out against the conflict, and donating to progressive causes. Wayne, meanwhile, was the face of conservative Hollywood, staunchly pro-war and deeply patriotic in the traditional sense. The clash between the two was inevitable. Newman considered Wayne's 1968 film, The Green Berets, outright propaganda, glorifying a war that was killing thousands of young Americans. Director Arthur Penn, a close friend of Newman, recalled, "Paul thought it was irresponsible. He said the movie was selling a fantasy about war while kids were dying." Wayne, for his part, despised anti-war activists like Newman, calling them unpatriotic. Their feud was carried out more in words than in actions, but it ran deep. Newman once told critic Rex Reed in an unguarded moment, "I admire his success, but John Wayne plays John Wayne in every movie. I've always tried to play someone different each time." The resentment only grew when Wayne won his Oscar for True Grit, 1969, while Newman, despite multiple nominations, went home empty-handed. Publicly, Newman was gracious. Privately, friends said he was frustrated. To him, Wayne was being rewarded for playing himself, while others worked tirelessly to transform into new characters. After Wayne's death in 1979, Newman softened slightly. He admitted, "We disagreed on practically everything, but you can't deny he was an American institution. Sometimes institutions make you uncomfortable, but that doesn't make them less significant." It was as close as Newman ever came to reconciliation. Still, the wounds lingered. For Newman, John Wayne wasn't just a rival actor. He was the symbol of an ideology he spent his life fighting against. Robert Redford. Finally, the number 1 spot. The actor who irritated Newman more than anyone else. The shock: it wasn't an enemy, a political opponent, or a rival. It was his closest collaborator and friend, Robert Redford. Together, they created magic. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, 1969, and The Sting, 1973, remain two of the greatest buddy films in Hollywood history. Their chemistry was legendary, their friendship immortalized in interviews and photographs. But behind the camera, Newman quietly seethed. Redford's chronic lateness drove him to distraction. Director George Roy Hill, who helmed both films, remembered, "Paul was military in his punctuality. He'd be on set before dawn, fully prepared. Then we'd all wait, sometimes for hours, for Bob to show up. It drove Paul nuts." Crew members even gifted Newman a gag clock on the Sting set. Every number on its face was replaced with the word Redford. The joke? No matter the time, it was always Redford o'clock. Sidney Pollack, who worked with Redford repeatedly, once admitted, "Bob has a different relationship with time. He doesn't mean disrespect, but he just doesn't live on the same clock as the rest of us." That might have been fine for others, but for Newman, disciplined, punctual, and meticulous, it was maddening. The irony was that Redford's performances never suffered. He could arrive hours late, step in front of the camera, and nail a scene in one take. Newman once grumbled to Hill, "The worst thing about this kid is he can show up 3 hours late and still be better in one take than most actors after a week of rehearsal. It's infuriating." Despite the frustration, Newman never let it affect their professional collaboration. In fact, their differences may have been part of what made their on-screen chemistry so electric. Redford himself later acknowledged this in a 2015 interview. "Paul and I were opposites. He was organized, I was chaotic. Maybe that's why it worked. We got under each other's skin, but we brought out the best in each other." At an AFI tribute, Newman distilled it perfectly. "Working with Robert Redford taught me patience. I had none before. I needed all of it with him. So while Redford may have been his most successful partner, he was also the one who tested Newman's patience the most. That's why he topped the list not out of hatred, but out of sheer enduring frustration. Paul Newman's secret list wasn't about grudges, it was about principles. He valued preparation, professionalism, and humility, and when others failed to live up to those standards, he noticed. Each name on the list reflected a different frustration. Tom Cruise's restless ego, Charlton Heston's politics, Frank Sinatra's carelessness, Marlon Brando's wasted talent, Steve McQueen's competitiveness, John Wayne's ideology, and Robert Redford's lateness. For Newman, these weren't just irritations. They were breaches of what he believed acting and fame demanded, responsibility to the work, to colleagues, and to audiences. What makes the list remarkable is how Newman handled it. He never publicly attacked these men during his lifetime. On set, he remained professional, never letting personal feelings interfere with the job. The list was his private reckoning, a way of being honest about his frustrations while maintaining dignity in public. For fans, the list is more than Hollywood gossip. It's a glimpse into the standards of a man who held himself and others to the highest expectations. It shows that even icons have limits, and that behind Newman's easy charm was a professional unwilling to compromise on what mattered most.